The rain had been falling since before dawn, the kind of rain that did not so much fall as settle, a gray drift against the windows of the assembly rooms in Harrowmere Town, and Beatrice Vane stood inside the doorway of the great auction hall, with rainwater still darkening the hem of her morning gown, and thought, quite calmly, that she would not cry today, no matter what they said. She had cried already. She had cried in the carriage on the way here, once, briefly, the way one might sneeze into a handkerchief, and then put the handkerchief away. That was finished. What remained was the ledger under her arm, the reticule at her wrist, and the number written in her own hand on a slip of paper, folded 3 times against her palm. £2,400. It was every coin she had in the world, and it was the last thing her husband had left her that anyone could not take. The porter looked at her twice. He had been told, no doubt, to expect a widow, but he had not been told to expect this one, and Beatrice watched his eyes do the small, familiar arithmetic that men's eyes did around her, the black bombazine, the plain bonnet, the width of her shoulders, the fullness of her figure that no cloak had ever quite disguised. She let him look. She had heard every unkind word in the language before her 25th birthday, and she had trained her face into stillness, the way other women trained their hands to the pianoforte, so that even her breathing gave nothing away. "Mrs. Vane," she said, when it seemed he might forget to ask, "for the sale of Fenmore's library." "The gentlemen are already gathered," he said, uncertain. "Then I shall not delay them." She stepped past him. "Now listen, child, because here is the shape of the thing. There are hurts the world gives a woman that she can name aloud, and there are hurts she cannot. And Beatrice Vane had swallowed the second sort for so long, she believed she had digested them entirely. She had not. And on this gray morning in the last month of the year, in the assembly rooms of a market town whose name most of London had never troubled to learn, the swallowing was about to end. The hall was long and low-ceilinged and smelled of damp wool and beeswax, and the particular mustiness of very old books stacked too close together. Along the raised platform at the far end stood the auctioneer's lectern, and behind it the goods of the late Sir Josiah Fenmore, arranged in lots, 3 long tables of folios and quartos and octavos, 1 glass case of manuscripts, a small case of miniatures, and, at the very back, the object Beatrice had come for. She did not let herself look at it yet. She had promised herself she would not look at it until she had a seat. The seats were arranged in 3 long rows, and the front row was full, and the second row was full, and Beatrice, who was neither vain enough nor foolish enough to press herself toward the front, took a chair at the end of the third row, where a gap opened between a lean man in a rust-colored coat and a stout country squire whose wig had been powdered 40 years ago, and never since. The squire looked at her. His mouth did the thing mouths did. He said nothing aloud, but he turned to his neighbor and murmured, and the neighbor laughed, and Beatrice unfolded her paper on her lap and smoothed it flat with the flat of her hand, and did not move her face at all. £2,400, written in Josiah's ink, which was to say her ink now, in her handwriting that had once been schoolroom copperplate, and had been shaped by years of writing letters that no one answered into something small and firm and unapologetic. She looked up. He was already looking at her. He stood against the wall near the second window on the left, a tall man in a dark green coat, gloves in one hand, the other resting on the head of a walking stick he did not appear to need. He was perhaps 40. His hair was black, and the light from the window did not warm it. He was not staring exactly, in the way the squire had stared. He was noticing. There was a difference, and Beatrice, who had spent a lifetime cataloging the difference between being looked at and being seen, felt the difference before she had time to distrust it. He turned back to the window. She turned back to her paper. The auctioneer, a small brisk man with the wet complexion of a man who took his brandy warm, mounted the platform and cleared his throat and began. The early lots went quickly. Sermons in bad Latin, an incomplete encyclopédie, 3 volumes of a botanical work that had been better in its subscription list than in its plates. Beatrice sat with her hands folded and let the bidding pass over her like weather. She was not here for these. She was here for lot 41, and until lot 41 she intended to be a widow at the back of the room, and nothing more. Around her, the noblemen bid. That was the wrong word for most of them, but it was the word they used for themselves, and Beatrice used it in the privacy of her own head with the small, dry mockery that had kept her upright through 11 years of marriage to a man twice her age and 2 winters of widowhood after. There was Sir Percival Halloway, whose father had bought a baronetcy from a grateful monarch and whose son had spent it, and who was now bidding on a Petrarch he could not read. There was Mr. Callum Grimsby, of the Bath Grimsbys, who was not a nobleman at all, but who managed his ambition like other men managed their debts, always in public. There was Lord Ashcombe, who had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly, and who bid on the miniatures without looking at them, because looking at them would have suggested he cared, and caring, in Ashcombe's circle, was a form of undress, and at the wall, still not moving, still not bidding, stood the man in the green coat. "Lot 23, called the auctioneer. "A first quarto of Marcus Aurelius, English translation, 1712, the Farnaby edition. Do I hear £5? The squire beside her raised a finger. The rust-coated man raised 2. Halloway, 3. It went up to £11, which was £3 more than the book was worth, and Beatrice noted the price on her sheet in the small margin she had left for such observations, because a woman who intended to spend £2,400 in a room full of men who did not think she could count needed to know what the room was willing to pay for what it did not understand. The bidding went on. She felt, at some point during lot 30, the man in the green coat look at her again. She did not turn. She had noticed, without meaning to, that he had not bid once. He was here for something specific then, like her. The auctioneer wiped his forehead with a handkerchief that had begun the morning white. "Lot 40, he called. "A collection of household prints, sporting subjects, unframed, 1790 through 1810. Do I hear £1? The prints went for £2, 10 to a man Beatrice did not know. "Lot 41, said the auctioneer. The room, which had grown lazy with the small lots, did not know yet that it should sit up. Beatrice's hands, folded in her lap, did not move. "Lot 41, the auctioneer repeated, and here his voice did the thing auctioneers' voices did when they came to the piece they had been paid to introduce well. "The Fenmore Book of Hours, illuminated manuscript, 15th century, Flemish, 142 leaves, the miniatures attributed to the workshop of the Master of Mary of Burgundy. Provenance authenticated by Dr. Rowley of the British Museum. A gentleman's ornament, a scholar's prize. Do I hear £100? The room woke. Halloway sat forward. Grimsby's face went still in the way that meant he was already counting. Ashcombe, who had been leaning against a pillar, straightened slowly and unstuck his shoulder from the wood. Half a dozen other men shifted, opened notebooks, glanced at their companions. Beatrice let out one long breath she had been holding since the porter looked at her, and then she raised her hand. £100, said the auctioneer. From the lady at the back. Do I hear 120? The squire beside her turned his head with such force that his wig moved on his scalp. 120, said Halloway, who had not yet looked to see who bid 100. 150, said Beatrice. Now the room looked. Now the whole gray, damp room, which had been arranged to pass her over as a piece of the furniture, turned and found her, in her morning gown, in her plain bonnet, sitting at the end of the third row with a folded paper on her lap, and her hand raised as steadily as if she were signaling for tea, and the noise in the room changed. It did not become louder. It became sharper. The sound of many small breaths being drawn in through many narrow noses. "Come now," said Halloway, and he did look then, and his mouth curled into the smile Beatrice had known would be waiting for her when she chose to be seen. "Madam, are you certain you are in the correct room?" "Quite certain, Sir Percival." "You are aware what is being sold?" "The Fenmore Hours," said Beatrice. "Flemish, 15th century. Attributed, not documented, to the workshop of the Master of Mary of Burgundy. 142 leaves. I have read the catalogue." "Read it," said Holloway, and this time he did not smile at her. He smiled at the room, which was the crueler thing. Perhaps some kind gentleman lent it to her. Two men laughed. It was the small laugh, the laugh that has already been arranged with the elbow and the eye, and Beatrice, who had been laughed at in this exact register at her wedding breakfast, and at 3 seasons in London, and at every county assembly for 11 years, kept her hand up. 150, repeated the auctioneer, uncertain now, glancing between them. 200, said Grimsby from her left, without looking at her. 250, said Beatrice. 300, said Ashcombe, and there was something in his voice she did not care for, something amused, something that had decided in advance to enjoy this. 350, she said. The squire beside her made a soft, wet noise that was almost a word. He said, half under his breath, but not so far under it that she was intended to miss it. "God's teeth! Has she confused a book of hours with a book of pies?" The laugh that followed was louder. Beatrice did not turn her face toward him. She turned her face toward the auctioneer. She said, 350. 350 from the lady, said the auctioneer, and now his eye had begun to see her differently, because auctioneers see money before they see anything else, and a widow at the back of the room bidding £350 without her handshaking is a different creature from a widow lost in the wrong hall. "Do I hear 4? 4, said Holloway, and I shall save the lady the trouble of the next bid. 450. 500, said Beatrice. The room stopped laughing. She has heard every unkind word in the language before her 25th birthday. Remember that, child. What made her hand steady was not courage. It was practice. 600, said Ashcombe. 650, said Beatrice. 7, said Grimsby. 8, said Beatrice. The auctioneer began to sweat visibly. He was pleased and he was frightened, both at once, because a book he had expected to sell for £400 was rising in his room like weather, and one of the bidders was a woman whose black gown alone told him that no living husband would answer for what she promised to pay. 800 to the lady, he said. Do I hear 9? 9, said Holloway. He had stopped smiling. 1,000, said Beatrice. She felt then the man in the green coat looking at her again. She did not turn. She had a rule, formed over 11 years, that when a room was determined to look at her, she chose one point in the middle distance and gave it her attention as if it owed her money. And she gave the auctioneer that attention now, and did not turn. 1,000 from the lady, said the auctioneer. Do I hear 1-1? Madam, said Holloway over the auctioneer, forgive me, but bids of this kind are ordinarily accompanied by evidence of means. I am afraid I must ask the courtesy of the room to know whether we are bidding against coin or against a widow's optimism. Beatrice turned her head. She had prepared on the drive here for the possibility that this would happen. She had chosen the words and she had folded the paper, and she had rehearsed the voice, and now she found, sitting in a room that had laughed at her twice, and would have laughed at her a third time, that all her preparation had been unnecessary. The voice came without preparation. It came because there was nothing else it could do. Sir Percival, she said, you have known me these 6 years. You dined at my husband's table thrice. You borrowed £400 of him in the summer of 1815, and repaid it in 3 installments, the last of them late. My means today are the settlement he left me, and the sale, last month, of Fenmore Cottage, which produced £2,040. I am solvent to the sum of £2,400, and I intend to spend, if you require me to, Every farthing of it in this room this morning. Would you like the name of my banker, or would you prefer to save your own coin for a bid you can honor?" Someone, somewhere behind her, made a sound like the beginning of a laugh cut off in its throat. Halloway's face did not move, but the color left it in a slow tide from the jaw upward, and Beatrice knew, with the small, terrible clarity that came sometimes in the middle of a rainstorm, that she had made an enemy for life, and that it did not matter, because he had been her enemy already, and until this morning she had only lacked the courage to say so aloud. 100, said Ashcombe into the silence, and now his voice was not amused. It was interested. 200, she said. 300. 400. 500, said Grimsby. 600, she said. The auctioneer's handkerchief was sodden. He held the gavel like a man holding a knife he did not know how to use. 17, said Halloway, who had found his voice. 18, she said. The bidding stopped. There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds, in which Beatrice heard, quite clearly, the rain on the roof and the breath of the squire beside her, and the small, stunned quiet of a room that had come to laugh and had stayed to watch. 19, said Ashcombe. 2000, said Beatrice. Ashcombe smiled slowly. 21, he said. 2,100 pounds. Beatrice's hand, still raised, did not tremble. Her heart, however, had gone somewhere behind her breastbone that she could not entirely locate. 2,400 pounds was the number folded in her palm. 300 pounds of daylight remained between her and ruin. 2-2, she said. 2-3, said Ashcombe. The room breathed in. 2-4, said Beatrice. Ashcombe's mouth opened and closed and opened again, and Beatrice watched him do the arithmetic she had done in her carriage at 4 o'clock that morning, the arithmetic of what one could spend in a public hall without ruining oneself before Christmas, and she saw, with a coldness that surprised her, that he was going to bid again. 2-5, he said. The auctioneer's gavel wavered. Beatrice looked at the folded paper in her palm. 2,400 pounds. She did not have 2,500. She did not have another shilling. And then, from the wall by the second window on the left, the man in the green coat said quietly, without raising his hand at all, 3,000. Every head in the room turned. He was still standing with his gloves in one hand and the other resting on the walking stick, and he had not moved from the wall, and he did not look at Beatrice at all. He looked at Ashcombe, and there was in his face nothing that could have been called anger, and nothing that could have been called kindness, only a very still, very level attention, of the sort a man might turn on a horse that had thrown its rider. 3,000 pounds, said the auctioneer, in the voice of a man who has been struck across the face with a fish. From, I beg your pardon, sir, I do not have the honor. Marchmont, said the man in the green coat. Ashcombe went white. Grimsby went whiter. Halloway sat down. You must understand, child, that in a county hall in a market town in the north of England in the year 1820, the name Marchmont carried in it 3 centuries of land, 2 seats in the Lords, 1 royal godfather, and an estate whose rents in a single quarter exceeded the annual income of every gentleman in that room combined. You must also understand that the Duke of Marchmont had not been seen in this county for 7 years, and that his coming here that morning, on that rain, to that sale, had not been announced in any paper, and that no one, including the auctioneer, had known that he was in the room, except Beatrice. Beatrice had known that a man in a green coat was watching her, and she had known that he had not bid on anything else, and she had known that he was, whoever he was, no one to be laughed at. She had simply not known his name. 3,000 from his grace, said the auctioneer, finding from somewhere the last dry piece of his voice. Do I hear 3,100? Ashcombe looked at his hands. He looked at his hands for what seemed to Beatrice a long time. Then he shook his head once and stepped back against his pillar. "Any further bid?" said the auctioneer. "Any further bid, gentlemen?" "Madam." Beatrice sat with her hand in her lap. "Going once." She did not move. "Going twice." The gavel came down. "Sold. To His Grace the Duke of Marchmont at £3,000. The room exhaled, and then, because rooms do what rooms do, it began to talk. Not loudly, in little half-turns, in murmurs behind gloves, in the small avid exchanges by which the county convinced itself it had understood something it had not. Beatrice folded her paper. She folded it once, and then again, until it was a very small, hard square against her palm, and then she put it into her reticule and she stood. She did not look at Holloway. She did not look at Ashcombe. She walked, in her plain, wet mourning, down the length of the hall, past the 3 rows of noblemen who had laughed at her and had stopped laughing, past the squire whose wig had shifted on his head, past the auctioneer who was mopping himself with a handkerchief that had by now surrendered its whiteness altogether, and she walked to the door, and at the door she stopped, because the man in the green coat was standing there. He had reached it before her. He held it open. "Madam," he said. "Your Grace. May I trouble you for a word?" "You may not," she said. "I'm going home." She had not meant to say that. She had meant to say something civil about the weather and pass through and leave him to whatever amusement had brought him to bid £3,000 against her for a book he did not want. But the word home had come up from wherever the earlier arithmetic had gone, and had walked out of her mouth in her own voice, and once it was said she could not gather it back. He did not move from the door. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "if you would grant me 5 minutes in the anteroom, I believe I can offer you what you came for." She looked at him then, properly, for the first time. Gray eyes, a long, quiet mouth, a face that had been handsome once and had become, over years she did not know about, something closer to weather-worn than handsome, though he was not old, perhaps 40, perhaps not quite 40, a face that noticed and did not say what it had noticed. She had known that face for the length of an auction, and she found, to her own irritation, that she had already begun to trust it. Not him, the face. 5 minutes, she said. 5 minutes. He led her, not to the small anteroom behind the platform, which was already filling with men who wanted to shake his hand, but to a narrow room across the corridor that had once served as a card room and now smelled of old smoke and older wax. He closed the door behind them. He did not sit. He did not invite her to sit. He said, "You know why you wanted the book." "I do." "I do not." He set his gloves on the small table between them. "I bid £3,000 against Ashcombe, because Ashcombe would have paid 4 to spite you, and I would rather have owned a book I do not want than watch him win. That is the whole of my reasoning. Now tell me why you wanted it, and if the reason is what I suspect, the book is yours at cost." He said it plainly. He said it as if he were transacting the sale of a horse. Beatrice, who had prepared for many things and had not prepared for plain speech, felt the ground shift under her feet a small, dangerous inch. "At cost." "At £3,000, which I have, which you, I take it, do not." "I have 2,400. "Then you shall pay me 2,400, and the remaining 600 is my price for the pleasure of watching Sir Percival Holloway learn to sit down." He almost smiled. He did not. "Why the book, Mrs. Vane?" She was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "It is not the book. It is a leaf in the book, the 83rd leaf. It is a miniature of the Nativity, and in the border of the miniature, if one looks with a glass, there is written, in a hand so small, it looks like a scratch, the name of my grandmother, Anna Fenmore. She painted it. She was apprenticed to a Flemish master in her youth, before her marriage, when a girl of her station could still be apprenticed to such a thing, and the leaf was her masterpiece. She gave the manuscript to my grandfather as a wedding gift. It was in our family until my father lost it at cards in 1804. Josiah, my late husband, bought it for me the summer before he died, and it was in his library, and when he died, his cousin claimed the whole of the library under an entail I could not break, and Fenmore, in his generosity, put the library up to auction rather than keep it, because he wanted the money more than he wanted the books. The hours went in with the rest. I have not been permitted to see it these 2 years. I came today to buy back the 83rd leaf. That is all. That is the whole of it. He looked at her. He looked at her for what seemed to her a very long time, and she watched the noticing in him arrange itself, quietly, into something else. Not pity. Pity she would have known how to refuse. Something quieter. Something she did not have a name for. "I see," he said. "You see nothing," she said, and her voice, which had been steady in the hall, began at last to shake, and she detested it for shaking, and she held it in her teeth until it steadied again. "You see a stout widow in wet mourning, who has spent every farthing she owns on a scrap of vellum with her grandmother's name on it. I do not require your sympathy, your grace. I require the book. You shall have it. At cost. At cost. And the 600, she said. I shall repay you. It will take me a year, perhaps 2, but I shall repay you. You shall not. I shall." He inclined his head. "As you like." She should have taken the book. She should have accepted the terms, and taken the book, and gone home. That is what a sensible woman does. But Beatrice Vane, who had lived a sensible life for 11 years, and a more sensible life for 2 after, discovered in that narrow, smoky card-room that sense had brought her nowhere she cared to have gone, and she said, before she could stop herself, "Why? Why what? Why the 600? Why the courtesy? Why any of it? You do not know me." "No," he said, "I do not." "Then why?" He was silent. He picked up his gloves. He set them down again. He said at last, "Because I have known Halloway and Ashcombe since I was 12 years old, and I have watched them treat rooms full of women like furniture, for as long as I have known them. And this morning I stood against a wall and watched them attempt to do it to a woman who had done her sums, and I found I had a preference." He looked at her then, plainly. "It was not charity, Mrs. Vane. It was a preference." "For what?" "For the woman who had done her sums." She did not have an answer to that. She did not have an answer to any of it. She stood in her wet mourning in the smoky card-room with the sound of the rain on the roof and the sound of the nobleman laughing on the other side of the door, and she felt, quite suddenly, the whole exhaustion of the morning come up into her chest, and she thought, with a clarity that startled her, that if he said one kind thing more she would sit down on the floor and cry, and she would never forgive him for having watched it. He did not say one kind thing more. He said, "You will want to arrange the transfer of funds through your banker. If you will give me his direction, I shall have my own man call upon him tomorrow, and the book shall be delivered to you before the week is out. Where are you living?" "At Vane Cottage, 2 miles east of Harrowmere, on the Wycliffe Road." "I know it." "You do not." "I know every cottage on the Wycliffe Road," he said. "It is my road." She had not known that. She had not troubled to know whose road it was. It had been her road for 2 years, and she had walked it and driven it, and never asked whose land she was on, because it was not the sort of question one asked when the answer would not change one's rent. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Then you are my landlord," she said. "I am. I have not paid my rent since Michaelmas." "I know." She felt her face flush, the first flush of the whole morning, and she hated it. "I intend to pay." "I know that too." "Then why have you not sent for it?" "Because," he said, My steward informed me at Michaelmas that the tenant of Vane Cottage was a widow of scholarly disposition, who kept her house clean, mended her own linen, taught the vicar's daughter to read Greek, and had asked politely for a fortnight's grace on account of a manuscript. I told him to give her the fortnight, and then I told him to give her the winter. I did not expect to meet her at an auction. Beatrice sat down. There was a chair against the wall, small and hard and unwelcoming, and she found herself in it without deciding to. Her legs had made the decision without her. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the man who was, it turned out, her landlord, and who had known her name, or something very like her name, before she had walked into the hall that morning, and she said, "You should not have done that." "Given you the winter?" "Yes." "Why should I not?" "Because," she said, and she did not know how to finish the sentence, and then she did. "Because I did not know. And a debt one does not know one owes is a debt one cannot repay in the right coin." He looked at her. He said quietly, "I shall remember that." He did not sit. He did not touch her. He said, "I shall send the book on Thursday. Good day to you, Mrs. Vane." He bowed. He was already at the door. "Your Grace," he turned. "You have not told me your Christian name." "No," he said, "I have not." He went out. The door closed behind him, and Beatrice Vane sat for a long time in the card-room, in her damp mourning, with the sound of the rain on the roof and a folded paper in her reticule, and she discovered, with a slow, unwilling astonishment, that she was not going to cry after all. She was going to laugh. She did. Once. Quietly. And then she stood up and went home. Now, understand what had happened, child, though she did not understand it yet herself. A woman had walked into a room to buy back a scratch of ink on a leaf of vellum bearing her grandmother's name. She had spent every coin she had, and it had not been enough, and a man against the wall had spent 600 more of his own, without asking, and she had left the hall the owner, technically, of a book she had not yet touched, and the tenant, technically, of a cottage whose rent had been forgiven her by a landlord she had never met. That is what had happened in the ledger of the world. What had happened in the ledger she did not keep was that Julian Marchmont, the 7th Duke of that name, who had not been seen in his own county for 7 years, had come home, and he had come home for reasons that were not the reasons anyone in that hall would have believed. The book came on Thursday, as he had said. It came in a plain deal box, wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, carried by a young man in a plain coat, who introduced himself only as Marchmont's clerk, and who left before Beatrice could offer him tea. Inside the box, wrapped again in flannel, lay the Fenmore Book of Hours. She unwrapped it at her kitchen table because she had no other table large enough, and she sat in her kitchen with the winter light on the tiles and turned the leaves, one by one, with the slow, disbelieving care of a woman who has not touched a thing she loves in 2 years. The 83rd leaf was there. Anna Fenmore. The name in the border was so small, she needed the reading glass her father had left her, and even with the glass she needed a moment for her eyes to find it, and when she found it, she put the glass down and sat very still, and did not weep, because she had promised herself she would not weep for anything the world had already taken, and this was, if the world was to be trusted, no longer taken. Beneath the book, at the bottom of the box, lay a folded sheet of paper. It was not a letter. It was an invoice, written in a small, firm hand, itemizing the sale price at cost, £2,400, less the outstanding rent of Vane Cottage from Michaelmas, £16 and 8 shillings, remitted with the landlord's compliments, giving a final sum due of £2,383, 12 shillings, payable at Mrs. Vane's convenience through Coots and Company. At the bottom, in the same hand, 4 words. I notice effort. J. She sat with the paper in her hand for a long time. I notice effort. The words were kind, and the words were exact, and the words were, in a way she could not quite name, the first 4 words anyone had said to her in years that she believed. She'd been noticed for many things in her life. She had been noticed for her size, and for her plainness, and for her father's disgrace, and for her husband's age, and for her widowhood. She had not been noticed for effort, not once, not in 11 years of marriage in which she had run a house, kept accounts, nursed a difficult old man through 2 illnesses, and a third that had killed him, and answered letters no one had answered on her behalf. She had done the effort. No one had noticed it, until a man against a wall on a rainy Wednesday had watched her raise her hand at an auction, and had noticed it, and had said so. "I notice effort." She folded the paper. She put it in the small tin box on her mantel, where she kept the things she meant to keep. That evening, sitting by her small fire with the book on her knees, Beatrice heard hooves on the road, and she thought, with a small, unreasonable lift in her chest, that it was him. It was not. It was a boy from the vicarage with a note from the vicar's wife, and the note said only that the county was talking about her, and that some of the talk was very bad, and that she should not go to church on Sunday until the vicar had spoken to her first. She went to church on Sunday. She went in her second-best mourning, which was better than her first, because she had mended the seam beneath the arm that had given way in the auction hall, and she took her usual pew, which was toward the back, and she kept her eyes on the prayer book, and she did not look up when the whispering began, and she did not look up when the whispering stopped. She did not look up when the vicar preached, with a color in his cheek that suggested he had chosen his text without pleasure, on the parable of the widow's mite. She did not look up when Lady Halloway, in the second pew from the front, turned her head and coughed the small sharp cough that women of her rank used in place of speech. She looked up once when Marchmont came in. He came late. He came alone. He walked up the aisle to the ducal pew at the front, which had been dusted that morning for the first time in 7 years, and he sat down in it, and he did not look at her, and he did not need to. Every other head in the church looked at her for him. She read her prayer book. She sang the responses. She took the wine at the rail from a vicar whose hand shook, and she went home in her own trap, and when she reached her own gate she found a second box waiting on the step, not a book this time. Coal, 6 sacks of it, stacked against the wall of her woodshed, with a small card on top in the same firm hand. "The winter is long. J." She stood in her own yard in her second-best mourning and looked at 6 sacks of coal, and did not know, for the first time in a great many years, what to feel. She had trained herself, since she was 15 years old, to receive nothing she had not paid for. She had trained herself so successfully that she had come to believe that nothing that arrived without an invoice was safe to keep. And here was coal, on her step, from a man who had already paid for her book and forgiven her rent, and defended her at an auction, and sat down in the ducal pew of her parish church on a Sunday morning without looking at her, in order to look at her. She wrote him a letter. She wrote 3 drafts of it, and burned 2. The third said, "Your Grace, I have received the book, and it is what I hoped, and I thank you. I have received the coal, and it is more than I can accept, and I ask you to send a cart to remove 3 of the sacks, that I may take 3 as a tenant, and return 3 as a woman who does not know what to do with the rest." Mrs. Vane. He did not send a cart. He came himself. He came on a Tuesday in the afternoon, in the same green coat and no walking stick, and he came alone, and he knocked at her front door as if he were a country neighbor, and not the man who owned the road he had walked. She opened the door with her hands still floury from bread, and she did not apologize for the flour. "I have come," he said, "to remove 3 sacks of coal." "You have come yourself." "I have." "For 3 sacks of coal." "For 3 sacks of coal, and to see the book." She let him in. He was very tall in her small parlor. He looked at her small parlor without commenting on its smallness, which she counted as the first mercy of the afternoon. She brought the book from the shelf and set it on the table, and she stood beside it with her hands still floury, and he sat down at her table, uninvited, and opened the book and turned to the 83rd leaf without asking her which leaf, and studied the border with the reading glass she offered him. And after a long moment, he said, "Anna Fenmore?" "Yes." "She was your grandmother?" "Yes." "She was also," he said, "my great-grandfather's cousin, on my mother's side. I did not know until Wednesday evening. I looked it up." He set down the glass. "You and I are distantly cousins, Mrs. Vane. I thought you should know." She sat down. She sat down opposite him at her own table, and she felt the flour on her hands and the winter light in her kitchen, and the small stubborn fire in her grate. And she said, because it was the only thing she could think to say, "That does not entitle you to give me coal." He almost smiled. He did not. "No," he said, "it does not. But it makes the coal, perhaps, less strange." "It makes it stranger." "Then I shall remove 3 sacks and leave you 3, and you shall take the 3 as a cousin, and we shall not speak of it again." She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Why did you come home?" He did not answer at once. He turned a page of the book. He turned it back. He said, quietly, "My son died 4 years ago. He was 7. After he died, I could not be in the house. I have been in London, and in Italy, and in a great many places that were not the house. I came home this month because my mother wrote to me, and said that if I did not come home, I would forget how, and I found that she was right. I have been in the house 4 weeks. I came to the auction because Fenmore's library was to be sold, and I thought a book might do for company. I did not expect to find a cousin bidding against Sir Percival Halloway for her grandmother's signature." He closed the book. "Now you know why I came home. It is not a thing I have told anyone. I should be obliged if you did not repeat it." Beatrice sat with her floured hands in her lap. She said, "I shall not repeat it." "Thank you." "Your Grace." "Julian." "I beg your pardon." "My Christian name," he said. "You asked it once. It is Julian. My mother is the only person alive who uses it. You may, if you wish, be the second." She did not use it. She did not, that afternoon, use it. She said only, "Would you take tea?" He would. She made tea. She made it in the plain brown pot she had brought from Fenmore Cottage, and she poured it into the 2 cups that had survived the move, and she sat opposite the 7th Duke of Marchmont at her own kitchen table in her second-best mourning, with flour on her hands, and she talked to him about the 83rd leaf, and about her grandmother, and about the Flemish master to whom her grandmother had been apprenticed, and about the difference between the workshop of Mary of Burgundy and the school of Simon Benning, and he listened. He listened the way he had watched her at the auction. He listened with the whole of his attention, as if he had somewhere else stopped listening to anyone at all, and had found, in her kitchen, a reason to begin again. He left before dark. He took 3 sacks of coal. He left her 3. He did not return for a week. In that week, the county did what counties do. Lady Halloway, who had coughed in church, called upon the vicar's wife and delivered a small speech about the impropriety of widows who bought manuscripts and forgot their station. Sir Percival Halloway, who had sat down in the auction hall, wrote to his solicitor about a boundary dispute concerning Vane Cottage that had been dormant for 11 years. Lord Ashcombe, who had gone white, took himself to London and told the story of the widow at the auction as a story against himself, which was the cleverest thing he had ever done, and which won him more friends than any story he had told against another. Mr. Callum Grimsby, who had been quieter than the others, did not tell the story at all. He rode to Vane Cottage on a Thursday morning and asked to see Mrs. Vane. She saw him at the door, because she did not intend to let him further. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "you will forgive the intrusion. I come as a friend." "You are not my friend, Mr. Grimsby." "No," he agreed, "but I may be of use to you nonetheless. May I speak plainly?" "You may." His Grace of Marchmont is, as I am sure you have observed, a man of unusual habits. He has been much noticed of late in your vicinity. The county remarks it. A widow in your position, cousin or no cousin, cannot afford to be remarked upon in that particular register. I have it in my power to place before you a proposal of a more regular kind, which would settle your position, retire your late husband's remaining debts, and remove you from the ambiguity in which you presently stand. I offer myself, Mrs. Vane, in marriage. I do so without preamble, because I understand you to be a woman who prefers plain speech." Beatrice looked at him. She looked at him with the same attention she had given the auctioneer, and she saw, quite plainly, the shape of the thing. He did not want her. He wanted the 83rd leaf. He had recognized, at the auction, that she had spent £2,400 on a book, and he had done the arithmetic that Marchmont had also done, and he had concluded that any woman who spent that sum on a book must have a further sum somewhere, and he had come to her door on a Thursday morning to acquire, by marriage, the further sum he had invented for her. He did not know she had no further sum. He did not know that the 83rd leaf was the whole of what she owned. He knew only what the county knew, which was that a widow had bid £2,400 at an auction, and he had built, upon that number, a fortune in his head, and he had come to marry it. She said, "Mr. Grimsby, I am not in a position to accept your proposal." "Consider it." "I have considered it." "In a week's time." "In a week's time," she said, "my answer shall be the same." He bowed. He did not smile. He said, "Then I regret, Mrs. Vane, that I must trouble you with a further piece of information. I have in my possession 3 letters, written by your late husband in the last year of his life, addressed to a woman in Dover who is not his wife, in which he acknowledges a son and settles upon that son an annuity of £200. The annuity was drawn against the Fenmore estate. It has been drawn, since his death, against you, though you did not know it. You will find, if you consult your accounts, that the sum has been paid quarterly by a solicitor who did not trouble to inform you. That solicitor was mine. I now inform you." He inclined his head. "The letters, of course, are the property of their addressee, but she is in reduced circumstances and would, I think, part with them for a consideration." Beatrice held the door. She held it with the flat of her hand against the wood, and she felt the wood under her palm, and she thought, with a coldness she had never felt before in her life, that this was the moment she had been trained for. Every insult she had ever swallowed, every cough in every church, every wig turned toward every neighbor, it had all been for this, so that when a man stood on her step in the winter light and threatened her dead husband's memory in order to marry a fortune she did not have, she would know how to be still. She was still. She said, "Good day, Mr. Grimsby." She closed the door. She sat down on the floor of her own hall with her back against her own door, and she did not cry. She did not cry because she had promised herself, at 15, that she would not cry for anything the world had already taken. And Josiah, whatever he had been, was a thing the world had taken, and the letters, whatever they were a thing the world had taken, and she would not cry. She wrote to Marchmont that evening. "Her Grace," she wrote, and then she crossed it out, because she could not write to him as if she were writing to a stranger, and she began again. "Julian," she wrote, and she was surprised to find that she had used his name, and she did not cross it out. "Julian, there is a matter I must place before you as my landlord, my cousin, and I now find, my only trustworthy correspondent in this county. I have this afternoon received a proposal of marriage from Mr. Callum Grimsby, which I have refused. In refusing, I have received also a threat, of a specific and detailed kind, concerning my late husband. I do not know whether the threat is founded in fact or in fabrication, and I do not know what use, if any, Mr. Grimsby intends to make of it. I write to you because you have shown me a courtesy I have not deserved, and because I would rather be honest with you now than found out by you later. I remain your obedient servant, and if you will still have me for one, your cousin, B. Vane." She sent the letter by the boy from the vicarage. He came at 10 the next morning. He came without his coat. He came on a horse he had not bothered to hand to any groom, because there was no groom at Vane Cottage. He came into her kitchen without knocking, and he stood in the middle of her kitchen with his hair wet from riding through a shower and his hand still holding the letter, and he said, "How much?" "How much what? How much does Grimsby want for the letters?" He did not say. He will say. "He wants my hand," she said, "more than he wants the money. The letters are the instrument. The instrument is not the object." He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at Ashcombe across the auction hall, and Beatrice saw for the first time what the nobleman of that county had spent 7 years being spared, which was Julian Marchmont angry. He said quietly, "You will not marry him." "No, I will not." "Then he will publish the letters." "He may." "Beatrice." She had not heard her own name in her own kitchen in her own voice from another mouth in 4 years. Josiah had called her Mrs. Vane, out of a formality that had passed for affection between them, and the vicar's wife called her Mrs. Vane, and the boy from the vicarage called her ma'am, and no one else called her anything at all. She heard her name, and she sat down at her own table opposite him for the second time in 10 days, and she said, "Yes." "Beatrice, if he publishes the letters, the county will use them to ruin you, not because they will believe your husband unfaithful. They will believe that gladly. They will use them to say that you knew, that you tolerated, that you paid the annuity in exchange for the settlement, that you are, in short, a woman who traded a marriage for a book, and having traded it, is unfit for the pew you sit in on Sundays. They will not use it against Josiah. They will use it against you. You understand this?" "I understand it." "You must let me handle it." "I must not." "Beatrice." "Julian," she said, and she was as astonished by her own use of it as she had been 3 sentences earlier by his. "I am 41 years old. I have been ruined once already, when my father lost the manuscript at cards, and my mother lost her nerve, and I was sent to live with an aunt who advertised me among her acquaintance as a girl of scholarly disposition and no expectations. I am not afraid of being ruined again. I am afraid of being handled. If you go to Grimsby on my behalf and pay him what he wants and bring me the letters, I shall owe you not £600, but my whole self, and I shall spend the rest of my life pretending that I did not, and I shall come to hate you for it, and I have not the strength in me for another hatred. So no, you will not handle it. You will help me handle it." "That is a different word." He was silent. He set the letter down on her table. He said, "What do you require?" "I require," she said, "the name of a good solicitor, not yours, mine. I require the address in Dover of the woman my husband wrote to. I require a fortnight, and a loan of £60 against my next quarter's earnings from the sale of the smaller books in Josiah's collection, which the entail did not touch, and I require your promise that whatever I do in the next fortnight, you will not do anything for me. Not one thing. Not a sack of coal. Not a bid at an auction. Not a defense in a pew. Nothing. Whatever comes at the end of the fortnight, I shall come to it myself, and I shall come to you if I choose, and we shall speak then of what remains." He looked at her. There was in his face a struggle she had not seen before and did not expect. A man who had spent 7 years not being in his own house, and had come home, and had walked into an auction hall to buy company, and had found instead a cousin in mourning who had done her sums, and who was now asking him, plainly, to stand aside while she stood up for herself. He said, "That is very hard." "I know. I do not do very well at standing aside." "I know." "Beatrice." "Julian." He inclined his head. He said, "Very well. A fortnight. The solicitor's name is Whitlock, of Whitlock and Ellsworth, in Harrowmere. The address in Dover I shall have to my clerk by evening. The 60 pounds shall be at your bank by tomorrow. I shall do nothing else. And at the end of the fortnight, whatever the outcome, you shall come to me and tell me what you have done. That is my condition. Not that I intervene, that I know. That is fair. It is not fair. It is what I can bear." She smiled then, for the first time in his presence. It was not a large smile. It was a small, tired, honest smile.